It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Countless agendas and objectives continue to be carried out by the completely engineered COVID-19 scenario. The cover-up of unfolding environmental collapse, and thus societal collapse, is core. Those in power will continue to drive wedges of division into already fracturing societies all over the globe. They will use every possible tool and event at their disposal to do so. Where do we really stand with COVID? Does anyone even ask why or how could it be that the official COVID infection count in the US is well over 100 times worse than China? How can that be? How did I arrive at such a figure? Here's how. China's official COVID infection total still stands at just over 83,000. The US total now stands at over 2,277,000 and climbing fast. This calculates to an infection total that is over 27 times higher than China's. But if we also consider the total population of China compared with the total population of the US, China's population being over 4 times higher, and we multiply the infection total comparison by 4, the total infection rate per capita is well over 100 times higher in the US. What's wrong with this picture? Is someone lying? Does such a question even deserve an answer? Is the US government and those who serve it actually trying to protect the health and welfare of the US population? Or is the true reality far darker than any of us would dare to believe? Let's connect some dots. The commercial-free Global Alert News Hour starts now. This first report headline was issued yesterday from multiple mainstream sources. Dr. Anthony Fauci says it's, quote, frustrating that Americans are ignoring science amid coronavirus pandemic. From that report, White House Health Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci said Friday that he is, quote, frustrated Americans aren't following recommended health guidelines to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Question: how many, even now, choose to believe Dr. Fauci is actually interested in slowing the spread of the engineered CV-19 pathogen? The same pathogen that peer-reviewed study proves was engineered with cooperating labs in the US and China via millions in funding that came from the US National Institute of Health with the participation and backing of Dr. Anthony Fauci. CNN anchor and former APAC lobbyist Wolf Blitzer called Anthony Fauci, quote, a national treasure, end quote. Question: Mr. Blitzer, a national treasure for who? The population or the power structure? As I cover the following reports and data, consider and remember these core factors. Rapidly unfolding environmental and societal collapse is fueling total power structure desperation. Geoengineering.org has tried to warn about this coming for over a decade. And there is this to consider. The U.S. population, often armed, is a rapidly increasing liability to those in power. These are points to keep in mind. Let's backtrack a bit for a moment to consider this April 28th headline from Newsweek and other mainstream sources. Quote, Dr. Fauci backed controversial Wuhan lab with US dollars for risky coronavirus research. For the moment, it seems that the engineered strains of COVID-19 that have so far been let loose are not as lethal as we were initially led to believe. Thus, the statistical manipulation of COVID mortality rates. Statistics that have been manipulated until it starts to seem every death is a COVID-19 death. This being said, consider that those who control governments, including our own, can stoke the existing COVID outbreaks to carry out their agendas and objectives. And further, they can let loose much more lethal strains of COVID-19 or other pathogens as they choose. Dr. Anthony Fauci has been the head of the NIAID, that's the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, since 1984, since AIDS, SARS, MERS, the swine flu, the list goes on. Question, which were random acts of nature and which were not? Again, consider Fauci's 2017 statement on film and on the record. Quote, there will be a surprise pandemic during this presidency, end quote. How did you know, Dr. Fauci? How did you know? Dr. Fauci and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, say that the constant wearing of face masks will save us. Even yesterday's headline report from multiple mainstream sources covered at the start of this broadcast pushed for a constant use of face masks. With that in mind, consider these next two headline reports published from multiple mainstream sources earlier this year. CDC, Centers for Disease Control, says surgical masks won't protect you from coronavirus. Another headline, multiple sources earlier this year. U.S. health officials say Americans shouldn't wear face masks to prevent coronavirus. And there's this to consider from Fox News. Surgeon General, quote, data doesn't back up wearing masks in public amid coronavirus pandemic. From newsmedical.net, wearing masks may increase your risk of coronavirus infection, experts say. From that report, England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer has warned that it was not a good idea for the public to wear face masks, as the virus can get trapped in the material and causes infection when the wearer breathes in. Also consider this headline report published last month from multiple sources. Quote, face masks pose serious health risk to the healthy, contributing to hypoxia and hypercapnia. I've covered some of this data in previous broadcasts, but it needs to be heard and considered again. From the report, a drop in oxygen levels, i.e. hypoxia, is associated with an impairment in immunity. Studies have shown that hypoxia can inhibit the type of main immune cells used to fight viral infections called the CD4 plus T lymphocyte. This occurs because the hypoxia increases the level of a compound called hypoxia-inducible factor 1. That's HIF-1, which inhibits T lymphocytes and stimulates a powerful immune inhibitor cell called the Tregs. This sets the stage for contracting any infection, including COVID-19, and making the consequences of that infection much graver overall. In essence, your mask may very well put you at an increased risk of infections, and if so, having a much worse outcome. The report continues, quote, people with cancer will be at further risk from prolonged hypoxia, as the cancer grows best in a microenvironment that is low in oxygen. Low oxygen also promotes inflammation, which can promote the growth, invasion, and spread of cancers. Repeated episodes of hypoxia have been proposed as a significant factor in atherosclerosis and hence increases all cardiovascular, i.e. heart attacks, and cerebral vascular, i.e. strokes, diseases. The report goes on to make these statements. There is another danger to wearing these masks on a daily basis, especially if worn for several hours. When a person is infected with a respiratory virus, they will expel some of the virus with each breath they take. If they are wearing a mask, especially an N95 mask or other tightly fitting mask, they will be constantly rebreathing the viruses, raising the concentration of the viruses in the lungs and the nasal passages. Medical science has proven that people who have the worst reactions to the coronavirus have the highest concentrations of the virus early on, and this leads to the deadly cytokine storm in a selected number of individuals. Report states this. It gets even more frightening. Newer evidence suggests that in some cases the virus can enter the brain. In most instances, it enters the brain by way of the olfactory nerves, the smell nerves, which connect directly with the area of the brain dealing with recent memory and memory consolidation. By wearing a mask, the exhaled viruses will not be able to escape and will concentrate in the nasal passages, enter the olfactory nerves, and travel into the brain. Again, I have covered this data in a previous broadcast, but it needs to be heard again. The point is not getting through. Mainstream media and their power structure puppet masters are drowning out the warnings from courageous scientists, the very few that have shown the courage to stand up and tell the truth. And these warnings come from a nationally recognized board-certified neurosurgeon, health practitioner, author, and lecturer. The 2004 recipient of the Integrity in Science Award. The nationally recognized physician that issued these dire warnings about the dangers of extended face mask use is Dr. Russell Blaylock. He serves on the editorial staffs of the Journal of the American Nutraceutical Association and the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons. That's the official publication of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. He, Dr. Blaylock, also serves as assistant editor-in-chief for the journal Surgical Neurology International. Blaylock is also a reviewer for the Journal of Food and Chemical Toxicology, among other journals. In addition, Dr. Blaylock was a teaching lecturer for the Foundation on Anti-Aging and Regenerative Medicine. And as expected, the medical industrial complex has launched a coordinated effort to downplay and discredit the extended face mask use warnings from this award-winning, highly regarded veteran physician. And now also, as expected, the verifiably corrupt vaccine patent holder, vaccine danger hiding Centers for Disease Control now tells us we should wear masks. Should this come as any surprise, any at all? What other wider horizon threats do we face that are being ignored, eclipsed, and otherwise covered up by the completely engineered COVID-19 scenario? Mainstream media just published this report. Quote, there's a 1 in 3 chance of a massive disaster that could be worse than COVID-19, says Deutsche Bank. From that report, analysts say there is at least a 1 in 3 chance that at least one of 4 major risks will occur within the next decade. A major influenza pandemic killing more than 2 million people. They can engineer that anytime they want. A globally catastrophic volcanic eruption, a major solar flare, or a global war. Also could be triggered anytime those in power choose. They state this further. In a 2-decade time frame, there is a 56% chance of one of these disasters occurring. These are the conclusions of the so-called analysts based on various studies and risk assessments. Here's the bottom line. Based on all currently available frontline data and statistics, if, and this is key, the human race remains on the current course, most of us, if not all of us, will be long gone within the next decade, if not sooner, let alone the longer-term projections being made by so many sources. Sources who speak of challenges that could, may, might affect us in the next 20 or 30 years. Again, here's the bottom line reality that too few have on their radar at this most critical point in time. When the planet's climate and life support systems collapse, it's game over. All other challenges are then moot. The completely engineered COVID-19 scenario is core to all of this. It is the power structure's response to all that is unfolding because they, those who control the flow of money and money printing, believe that they have the right to completely control and eventually cull whomever they wish. While the orchestrated COVID-19 scenario and surrounding forms of political theater, political absurdity continue to distract so many from the wider horizon, the clock continues to tick. Consider this new headline report from numerous sources. Quote, world has 6 months to avert climate crisis, says energy expert. From that report, the world has only 6 months in which to change the course of the climate crisis and prevent a post-lockdown rebound in greenhouse gas emissions that would overwhelm efforts to stave off climate catastrophe. One of the world's foremost energy experts has warned. A lot of potential agendas visible in that statement, isn't there? Is our situation this bad? Is the horizon that dark? No. No, it's even worse. But does this new report tell the whole story? Does it tell the whole truth? Again, the answer is no. We don't have 6 months before the point of irreversible climate collapse is crossed. That occurred several decades ago. The question that remains is, will any make it through the gathering storm that is now unfolding? Many in the ranks of the climate science community have been actively engaged in a form of covert support of climate engineering and atmospheric particulate spraying operations by falsely claiming that the toxic atmospheric aerosols that these scientists pretend are from industrialized pollution only are the only thing saving us from immediate planetary meltdown. But is such a conclusion supported by available science data? Again, the answer is no. How long is the list of highly dangerous and destructive climate engineering consequences that the covert climate engineering salesmen are not disclosing? Here's a few. Geoengineering is destroying the ozone layer by itself, an extinction-level event. Geoengineering is disrupting the entire global hydrological cycle, causing immense downstream cataclysm from drought to deluge. Geoengineering is a core contributing factor to the rapidly worsening wildfire conditions around the globe. Search the Engineering Wildfires section at the top of the homepage at geoengineeringwatch.org. Geoengineering is interfering with Earth's natural cloud production processes. Geoengineering fallout is completely contaminating soils, waters, and every breath we take. I could go on, but hopefully the point has been made. Those who overtly or covertly push climate engineering as any form of cure are in actuality pushing planetary omnicide. There is no benevolence in climate engineering, none. And there can be no legitimate discussion about the climate or the state of the climate without first and foremost acknowledging and including the subject of climate engineering, the ongoing operations. The report in question then goes on to push so-called green jobs as a form of savior. Is such a conclusion grounded? Again, the short answer is no. So-called green jobs in the so-called renewable energy field are not what the public has been led to believe, as the recently released documentary Planet of the Humans so accurately disclosed. Is there any place to hide from the climate engineering onslaught and its countless consequences? Again, the answer is no. After carrying out very extensive climate research in the late 90s, I chose to locate off-grid in the wilderness of Northern California. Northern California and Southern Oregon should have seen a steady increase of rain on a rapidly warming planet. Climate engineering operations have, thus far, completely altered the equation, not just in Northern California, but worldwide. Mathematically and statistically speaking, short of nuclear cataclysm, climate engineering, aka weather warfare operations, are the most dangerous and destructive activity ever deployed by the human race. Moving on from CNBC, the International Monetary Fund set to slash economic forecasts and warns of a crisis, quote, unlike anything the world has ever seen. Again, for the record, what is unfolding is not just an economic crisis. It's a crisis of potential, if not probable, planetary omnicide, short of a complete course correction by the human race. More breaking dire frontline headlines in a moment, but first, to each and every individual that's doing their best to stay informed, to wake others, and to help turn the tide, thank you more than I can say. It is our collective efforts that can yet make a difference. This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the Global Alert News Hour, episode number 254, June 20th, 2020. In this broadcast, news that covers the issues we must face if we're to have any chance of changing course. This commercial-free Frontline News broadcast is brought to you by Geoengineeringwatch.org and paid for by Geoengineeringwatch.org. This news hour is broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. Saturday mornings from 6 to 7 AM, Sunday mornings, same time slot, repeat broadcast. We are also aired on the East Coast by the PRN Radio Network, Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Recordings of this broadcast can be found at geoengineeringwatch.org under the recent top stories and radio sections. The latest Geoengineering Watch awareness-raising printed materials can be ordered from the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for our approximate cost of producing and shipping. Again, as I state every week, a picture is worth 1,000 words. These materials are extremely effective at waking anyone who's willing to wake up. And given the current lockdown scenarios, the U.S. Postal Service can be used to mail out our 20-page booklets, for example. We have about 200,000 of those in circulation. We have about 1.5 million of our two-sided color glossy flyers in circulation at this most critical moment in time. Sowing the seeds of credible data from a credible source is key to reaching a critical mass of awareness in the population, which we must reach if we're to have any chance of changing course. We must have an army of the awakened to go over this every week. The only chance we have of stopping the insanity is from the inside out. When we wake enough of society up so that they realize their family members, or perhaps when their family members realize they themselves are participating in the insanity, either actively or passively, because As I state so often, those in power could not do what they do without the active or passive support of the majority of the population. Speaking of which, as our planet's life support systems continue to unravel, will global conflict be the next card played by those in power? And with that in mind, let's ask this question. How is it possible that those who hold the highest offices in government, including the highest office in the land, those who have done everything imaginable to dodge military service themselves, are allowed to wage war? Why is this allowed by populations? On the subject of the global power structure doing everything they can to tighten the noose around our collective necks, here's a recap of the unfolding agenda of societal lockdown and control. On May 1st, 2020, 45 Congress members co-sponsored Bill H.R. 6666, proposing to spend $100 billion in 2020 to hire, quote, contract tracers, coronavirus testers, and reporting agents. If passed, this would create an unprecedented new mega industry for what appears to be a type of medical martial law. Proponents of this bill apparently want to hire a massive number of staff to enforce, quote, social distancing, to administer tests in our own homes, apparently whether we consent or not. The bill even appears to grant the right to take people who test positive, quote, from their homes. Sounds a lot like something we might expect from China, doesn't it? Speaking of China, how's the engineered COVID-19 scenario going there? This new headline report: Beijing coronavirus outbreak, travel restricted to tackle, quote, extremely severe situation. The report states restrictions on travel to and from China capital brought in as neighborhoods sealed off and venues closed. From that report, authorities in Beijing have described the city's coronavirus outbreak as, quote, extremely severe. Again, I've stated they're not going to let these fires die down, and they will stoke them with something much more virulent if and when they feel they need to. Report continues. Authorities in Beijing, and that's not just China, by the way, that's the U.S. and everywhere else. We have the same global power structure, all colluding and cooperating on the COVID issue, on the climate engineering issue, and countless other issues. Global cooperation, at least for the moment. As everything unravels, let's hope the power structure starts to feud amongst themselves. We would expect this, just like mafia families when there's no longer enough to go around. Again, the report continues. Authorities in Beijing have described the city's coronavirus outbreak as, quote, extremely severe, as dozens more cases emerged and travel from the city was curtailed. Additional neighborhoods were fenced off on Tuesday with security checkpoints set up at residential compounds. The high-risk people, such as close contacts of people who test positive, were prevented from leaving the city. The epidemic situation in the capital is, quote, extremely severe. They keep reciting that term. Beijing city spokesman stated at a press conference. They said, right now we have to take strict measures to stop the spread of COVID-19. Report continues. More than 20 neighborhoods in the Chinese capital have now been designated medium risk, which means authorities can impose stricter restrictions on the movement of people in cars and carry out temperature checks. Health authorities said they sealed off residences and people are in quarantine would have food and medical provisions delivered to them. On Tuesday, statewide media appeared to push the idea that the virus had come from abroad. The chief epidemiologist at the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention said that the strain was most similar to those seen in Europe and the U.S. or Russia. He further stated, quote, it is clearly an indication that the virus strain is different from what it was 2 months ago, he told state broadcasters. The virus strain, he continued, is the major epidemic strain in European countries, so it's from outside China brought to Beijing. Does anybody really think that those in power are legitimately trying to make a vaccine for a pathogen that has so many strains that they are continuing to release and that they themselves, the same people making the vaccines, were directly responsible for creating? We are truly living in a planetary asylum. If a critical mass of global populations are not awakened to the wider horizon very soon, if they're not awakened to what's unfolding and why, we, all of us, will very soon reach the end of our collective journey. The CV-19 fires will continue to be stoked as needed by those in power. And so far, with the active or passive cooperation or apathy of the majority of the population, they're focused on everything but the horizon. That must change. About the ongoing global protests. Which protests does the power structure not only allow, but actually further fuels with the mainstream media they control, and which protests are being made highly illegal, with draconian penalties for any who dare to participate. Consider the following new report from Huffington Post and other sources. A set of headlines, actually. The first from last month. Quote, yet another state quietly moves to criminalize fossil fuel protests amid coronavirus. From that report in March, Kentucky, South Dakota, and West Virginia passed laws restricting pipeline protests. Alabama is poised to become the fourth. Then this update from earlier this month. Quote, Mississippi set to become the 13th state now, that's how much has elapsed since the first headline, to criminalize fossil fuel protests. A bill intended to have a chilling effect threatens 7 years in prison for protesters and up to $100,000 in fines for groups supporting them. Yes, some types of protests serve those in power. Some do not. About protests and the looting, pillaging, and plundering that sometimes comes with them. Yes, it's wrong. Those who loot, plunder, and pillage should be held accountable. But what about the white-collar criminals that loot, plunder, and pillage from the trough of public and government funds? The Wall Street criminals. Are they ever held accountable? Ever? And we should ask, where are the protests against the climate engineering, weather, and biological warfare assault affecting every single living organism on this planet? Affecting our air, affecting our soils, our waters. What about the so far betrayal of academia, not just in the medical industrial complex, but in the climate science community? The climate science community pretending that the climate engineering elephant in the sky is not really there, that we're not really seeing what we're seeing. When will that betrayal stop? When will members of the science community band together and stand up together so that they cannot be shot down so readily, so easily? When will they decide that their paychecks and pensions mean nothing on a dead planet? It means absolutely nothing, and we are perilously close to a planet that no longer supports life. And yet the deceptions continue. From scientificamerican.com, this headline from last week: a screen of, quote, old smoke hangs around in the atmosphere. They blame these massive particulate banks on everything from, quote, old smoke to massive plumes of atmospheric particulates from Africa that seem to migrate all the way to California. The science community is towing the line for those in power. And to be clear for the record, I'm not stating that there's not smoke in the atmosphere. I'm not stating that there's not dust blowing out of Saharan Africa. But I'm saying that those aspects are used for cover for the climate engineering operations stated by their own most recognized representative, Dr. David Keith, having a goal of dumping 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates into the atmosphere annually. 20 million tons. And academia continues to use every imaginable excuse to explain away where all this particulate matter is coming from, including plastics. I'll get to more of that later in this broadcast. Plastic nanoparticulates also raining down on us, as we've stated at geoengineeringwatch.org for nearly a decade. From this report of the, quote, old smoke, how this thin layer of atmospheric aerosol particulates might impact global climate remains to be seen. The report states the smoky screen distorts the effects of sunlight. Sounds a lot like solar radiation management, doesn't it? Reaching the Earth. But whether it will warm or cool the planet's surface in the future remains unknown, i.e., the climate engineers have no idea or no concern for the decimation they're causing to the planet, being admitted by academia here. The report states the simple message is that the smoke is more pervasive than we thought, almost everywhere. That's because it's not just smoke. This so-called study, which is doing nothing less than covering the tracks of the climate engineers, was sponsored by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who, for the record, along with the National Weather Service, has an illegal federal gag order on them. The study was published last week in the journal Nature Geoscience. It concluded that this thin screen of, quote, smoke hanging in the troposphere, the lowest layer of the atmosphere, which extends about 6 miles above Earth, dims sunlight reaching the planet. What a coincidence. The exact objective of climate engineering operations. The report further states, the aerosol cloud effect is the largest uncertainty in our current understanding of the climate system. No, there's an even larger uncertainty in all climate studies and assessments, the criminal omission of the climate engineering factor. Have some mainstream media meteorologists had an on-air slip? Admitting to a degree to the climate engineering issue, listen carefully to the following audio recording.
Is geoengineering real? ABC Channel 7 Chief Meteorologist Mike Kruger recently made the following statements on the air, which were recorded by geoengineeringwatch.org.
And geoengineering is indeed a real study. It's a real thing that is being conducted in many different ways. Geoengineering, which is legitimate and real and not dangerous, at least chemical-wise.
While publicly admitting to the geoengineering reality, ABC Channel 7 Chief Meteorologist Mike Kruger claims to know that the chemicals being used are not dangerous. Geoengineeringwatch.org would like to ask this of you, Mr. Kruger. How exactly are you able to come to such a conclusion, given the fact that countless lab tests from all over the globe have proven highly toxic climate engineering elements like aluminum, barium, strontium, and polymer fibers are in fact raining down through the atmosphere, toxic elements which we are all inhaling with each and every breath we take?
And geoengineering is indeed a real study. It's a real thing that is being conducted in many different ways. Geoengineering, which is legitimate and real and not dangerous, at least chemical-wise.
Let me repeat that quote. Not dangerous, at least chemical-wise, end quote. In regard to such a statement, it must be placed in one of two categories: unimaginable ignorance for a so-called expert or outright deception. Take your pick. Via massively powerful microwave transmission ionosphere heater installations like HARP and atmospheric particulate spraying, the climate engineers can augment heat or enhance cold. They control the flow of precipitation, drought, or deluge. This is not to negate all other countless forms of anthropogenic damage to the planet. Rather, it is to acknowledge the greatest single form of human-caused climate and environmental damage that is being systematically hidden from global populations. More headlines, new from numerous sources. Quote, climate crisis alarm at record-breaking heat waves in Siberia. From that report, unusually high temperatures in regions linked to wildfires, oil spills, and moth swarms. The report states a prolonged heat wave in Siberia is, quote, undoubtedly alarming. Climate scientists have said the freak temperatures have been linked to wildfires, a huge oil spill because of the melting tundra, and a plague of tree-eating moths. On a global scale, the Siberian heat is helping to push the world towards its hottest year on record in 2020. We just had the hottest May on record. And for the record, we just passed the 424th consecutive month of above normal global temperatures. That's over 35 years in a row. And this is in spite of temperatures and statistics being falsified to the downside. The planet's former miraculous climate equilibrium has been completely obliterated. Every single climate engineering operation will further fuel the unfolding planetary meltdown. Keyword, overall. Again, 2020 is forecast to be the warmest year on record in spite of a temporary dip in carbon emissions owing to the coronavirus pandemic. Engineered pandemic. Temperatures in the polar regions are rising fastest because ocean currents carry heat toward the poles, and reflective ice and snow is melting away. Again, climate engineering altering upper level wind currents. That alters ocean currents, warmer water pushing toward the poles. From every conceivable direction, climate engineering is pounding the nails into our collective coffins. The report continues. Russian towns in the Arctic Circle have recorded extraordinarily high temperatures. In May, surface temperatures in parts of Siberia were up to 10 degrees C above average. This winter was the hottest in Siberia since records began 130 years ago. Total meltdown. It's part of a feedback loop as the methane deposits in Siberian tundra melt and literally explode into the air column. That methane rises into the atmosphere and is fueling the covering of the planet with a layer of methane that's like a layer of glass. Please search Siberian methane craters and look at those images, and you will be absolutely shocked at what mainstream media is not telling us. And for those that are still clinging to the grand solar minimum global cooling false narrative, please look at real data. Look at real statistics. The solar minimums are meaningless against the backdrop of what we have done to the planet. I'm not saying they're not real. Some have accused me of saying solar minimums are not real. I've never, ever said that. What I said is the effect of the solar minimums are meaningless against the backdrop of anthropogenic damage to the planet. And if we look at extreme solar minimum events like the Maunder minimum, that effect was only a 0.25% reduction in total global solar irradiance, thermal energy buildup. 0.25%, that's 1/400th. Means virtually nothing against the tidal wave of anthropogenic damage and heating that is being caused to the planet. More to environmental destruction from mongabay.com. 14 straight months of rising Amazon deforestation in Brazil. The rising deforestation troubles scientists who fear that the combination of forest loss and the effects of climate change, more correctly scientifically termed, in this case, climate collapse, might, trigger the Amazon rainforest to tip toward a drier ecosystem which is more prone to fire. There's no could or may or might. It's well underway. We are losing the Amazon, we lose the trees, and we are done. No trees, no people. Dead oceans, no people. No ozone layer, no people. All of it's happening at once. The data thus suggests 2020 might be a particularly dire year for the Amazon. It's already a given. There's no could or may or might. From the Washington Post and other sources, Western states are entering an active wildfire season just as coronavirus cases spike. From that report, coronavirus and the West's wildfire season are on a collision course. The virus is in an upswing in several Western states that are starting to see increased fire activity, especially those at heightened fire risk during July. This year's wildfire season will present unprecedented challenges for firefighters, emergency managers, and the public, particularly when it comes to evacuations. There has been particular concern about a so-called second wave of the virus coinciding with the autumn fires in California, which have historically been the most disruptive and deadly blazes. However, it has now become clear that the threat for coronavirus and wildfires to overlap is starting earlier. Wildfires have already prompted evacuations in Arizona and California. For those willing to examine shocking facts that elaborate on exactly how the climate engineers are connected to wildfires and are, in fact, utilizing wildfire smoke to enhance their sun-blocking objectives, search and examine the Engineering Wildfire section on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. More headlines from numerous sources. Quote, Siberia's persistent freakishly mild weather is reverberating around the world. From that report, during the spring, stubborn and sprawling areas of high pressure parked over the region resulted in parts of Siberia recording temperature departures from average that reached a staggering 18 degrees. That's 10 degrees Celsius, 18 Fahrenheit. According to the Copernicus Climate Change Service, some of the April fires in eastern Russia dwarfed the infernos from this time last year. It's coming for the West Coast as well. They're setting the stage for it right now, which ultimately roared through 7 million acres in total, more than the size of Maryland, and sent smoke drifting as far as the United States. Plug this into everything I've already covered in this broadcast. Report states, meanwhile, in the Alaskan Arctic, which has also seen sudden shifts to hotter and drier summers, wildfires are igniting in unusual locations, such as western parts of the state, close to the Bering Sea. Most of Alaska's annual wildfires are ignited by lightning. Again, plug climate engineering into that. The electrically conductive metallic particles that are sprayed into the atmosphere, building up static charges, more conductive to those charges, less rain, i.e. more lightning, more wildfires. So many roads lead straight back to climate engineering. Again, please search the Engineering Wildfire section, Engineering Drought section, Engineering Winter sections, all on geoengineeringwatch.org. New from multiple sources, this headline: climate worst case scenarios may not go far enough. Cloud data shows. No could, no may, no might. The worst case official projections are woefully shy of how dire and immediate what we face actually is. Bouncing back for a moment to what is occurring over Siberia, the quote, sprawling areas of high pressure parked over the region. Again, a direct result of ionosphere heater installations, massively powerful microwave transmission facilities that can heat the ionosphere, create high pressure heat domes, which in the northern hemisphere spin clockwise. This helps the geoengineers to steer the upper level wind currents, helps them to cool off some regions at the cost of frying others. And the same is occurring on the U.S. West Coast, the, quote, ridiculously resilient ridge of high pressure that parks and stays there and fries us, sometimes week after week. This is not nature. Once you interfere with the climate system, you disrupt the entire climate system, and the level of intervention is incomprehensible. So many countries participating, either actively or passively, in this insanity, all for their own reasons. The leaders of countries all over the globe, criminally corrupt, all colluding and cooperating, whatever their surface or public disputes or tensions might be. Behind the scenes, they are colluding and cooperating, with few exceptions, again, like the state of Iran, who publicly stated on the floor of the UN that NATO climate modification programs were cutting off the flow of precipitation to that country, but our media never reported that, did they? This report, Climate Worst Case Scenarios May Not Go Far Enough, cloud data shows, finishes with this statement, quote, clouds will determine humanity's fate. The most recent modeling suggests clouds will make matters worse. So why is solar radiation management being conducted? Because it is not about doing anything benevolent. The intentional interference with Earth's life support systems is malevolent and suicidal. Data supports that conclusion. From climatenewsnetwork.net and other sources, forest trees are growing shorter and dying younger. Anybody who says the planet is greening is not looking at reality or real statistics from the front lines. And I always have to state this caveat. This doesn't mean there's not green trees in places. I'm speaking in an overall global context. Flora is dying all over the globe. That's a statistically inarguable fact. I just came back from a heartbreaking trek into our forest here in Northern California. Trees are dying everywhere. It doesn't mean there's not live trees. The fir trees are completely tanking. Other trees are thinning, weakening, collapsing, fungal infections. The canopies are thinning due to the massively intense UV. The forests are dying around the globe. There's no arguing this for anybody who knows anything about trees. And if any so-called expert says anything other than that, they are either completely ignorant of the field in which they are claiming to be experts, or they're lying. Take your pick. And consider this, that around 32 degrees C, that's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, tree growth halts and trees start to die. At 104 degrees Fahrenheit, photosynthesis stops. The warmer the planet gets, the less capable it is of sequestering carbon. Forests become and are becoming and have already become carbon sources instead of carbon sinks. We are losing the battle by the day. And every single day that climate engineering is allowed to continue, we'll continue to pound the nails into our collective coffin. And on that subject, this new headline from carbonbrief.org about the jet stream. Here's the headline. Is climate change causing more, quote, blocking weather events? Just described these earlier in this broadcast. The report states the past few months have seen some remarkable weather, from the UK's sunniest spring on record to Siberia's dramatic heat wave and, quote, zombie wildfires. They burned all through winter under the ice. Key to this unseasonable weather are persistent high-pressure blocking weather systems which bring clear, dry conditions on the ground below for many days or weeks. The report states blocking events force away oncoming low-pressure systems that would bring the prospect for clouds and rain. They are particularly synonymous with heat waves and droughts. I just stated this, and this report is confirming that in the summer, and bitterly cold conditions in the winter, again, blocking moisture from flowing in. Both extremes are possible. The report then goes to great length to push the conclusion that climate change is forcing more jet stream, quote, blocking scenarios, when in fact the high-pressure blocking scenarios are causing yet more climate disruptions and environmental destruction. What is the elephant in the room that is not surprisingly being completely ignored? Again, the global network of ionosphere heater facilities like HARP. Ionosphere heaters are the core causal factor that is facilitating the persistent high-pressure heat domes which are wreaking havoc all over the world. The climate engineers can cut off the rain to California for as long as they want. They can continue to hold the ionosphere heater-induced high-pressure heat dome over the U.S. West. They can again set the stage for epic wildfires. The hot to cold and back again weather and temperature whiplash scenarios will continue in many regions. Other areas will more consistently be fried, others flooded. Climate engineering operations are inseparable from it all. What is the world's most recognized geoengineer, David Keith, stated on the record from his book, a case for climate engineering. He said this: emergencies entail extreme measures, a narrow focus on a single problem that may justify suspension of democratic due process. What does that translate to? It translates to this: just as is the case with the COVID-19 pandemic, in the case of climate engineering, those in power feel they have the right to decide who is subjected to drought, who is subjected to deluge, who is subjected to wildfires. Did we give them that right? The unfortunate answer so far is yes. Silence is consent, and this equation must change. Henry David Thoreau said this: how does it become a man to behave towards the American government today? I answer, Thoreau says, that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. Henry David Thoreau also said this, which I have pondered on more times than I can recall. He said, "Thank God men cannot fly, or they would lay waste to the skies as they have done to the earth." How true that statement is. More headlines from sciencemagazine.com. Plastic rain in protected areas of the United States. From the New York Times, where's airborne plastic? Quote, everywhere, scientists find. There's no nook or cranny on the planet where it doesn't end up, the lead researchers of a new study said. Polymer fibers, part of climate engineering, part of the climate engineering fallout. Geoengineeringwatch.org has stated this on the record for a decade. It is not just decomposing plastics being swept up into the air column. It is polymer fibers that are part of the climate engineering operations, and we are absorbing them, inhaling them with every single breath we take. No place to hide from those fibers, from the toxic heavy metal particulates that are part of climate engineering operations, and from the increasingly decimated atmosphere, the ozone layer, without which we all die. The planet is under assault from countless directions, but the single most destructive factor, the single greatest threat and most immediate threat we collectively face, short of nuclear cataclysm, is climate engineering. Consider this headline of Total Deception, published last week and pushed by numerous so-called science sources. Quote, half the Earth is relatively intact from global human influence. What a monumental lie. I pinned and sent the following message to the authors of the report. Hello, Jason and Kat. Thank you for caring about what is yet left of the planet's rapidly waning life support systems. I truly wish I shared your optimism in regard to how much of the environment is, quote, relatively intact from global human influence, end quote. But if all the pieces of the puzzle are examined, such optimism does not seem warranted. The collapse of flora and fauna is off the charts, even in remote regions. I live completely off the grid in the wilderness of Northern California. I supervised 6 major habitat restoration projects in this wilderness region, 3 state projects, 3 federal. The decline of ecosystems in Northern California in the wilderness zones over the last decade has been horrific. There are numerous major factors being omitted from all, quote, officially sanctioned environmental assessments and publications. Some examples follow. Intense and damaging UV radiation is taking an immense toll on flora, on insect populations, and thus on ecosystems as a whole. The tree die-off is already catastrophic, as is the collapse of terrestrial and aquatic insect populations. I'm part of a research team that has measured and monitored both factors just covered. In the case of UV radiation, UVC is now reaching Earth's surface at significant levels. Our team includes a former NASA contract engineer that is metering UV levels with state-of-the-art metering equipment supplied to him by our group, geoengineeringwatch.org. In regard to insect population collapse, that data has been supplied to our team by a former U.S. Forest Service multi-degreed biologist and a former California Department of Fish and Game biologist. As I am sure you are aware, many science teams and studies have now confirmed the unfolding global insect apocalypse. Regarding forest floor soils, they are being heavily contaminated from elements that are coming down in precipitation, i.e. industrial pollution and climate engineering element fallout. So much contamination, including aluminum, primary element in climate engineering operations, that forest floor pH values have skyrocketed in our region from 10 to 12 times toward neutral. These are normally acidic soils in our region. We have the USDA historical baselines. Summary: the planet is in a dire condition and getting worse by the day. Anthropogenic activity, including climate engineering, has left nothing untouched or untainted. Sincerely, Dane Wigington, geoengineeringwatch.org. Find authors of articles of total disinformation and public pacification, and send those offers credible data from a credible source, wake them up, let them know that we know they now know what's wrong. Carl Sagan said this: anything else you're interested in is not going to happen if you can't breathe the air and drink the water. Do something. You are, by accident of fate, alive at an absolutely critical moment in the history of our planet. Again, from Carl Sagan. The human race is not just heading toward the edge of the cliff. Collectively speaking, we have long since leapt into the abyss. The question that remains is this: will any survive the fall? Morpheus in the movie Matrix said this: you have to understand most of these people are not ready to be unplugged, and many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system they will fight to protect it. The character Morpheus, again from the film The Matrix, also said this: what you know, you can't explain, but you feel it. You've felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. I always felt it was coming, always, that it was inevitable. Some of my earliest memories were of moments when I had epiphanies of impending doom, epiphanies that came from what I could see occurring in the world, blatantly obvious and undeniable insanity that reason and logic made clear could not be maintained. I remember a moment when I was 11 years old, standing on a baseball field in Upland, California. The smog was so thick that visibility was a quarter mile or less. Breathing was impaired for even the most healthy. And though this was extremely alarming for me, what alarmed me still more was that none of the adults present seemed the least bit concerned. How could this be? I wondered. Even earlier, when I believe I was 8 years old, my first trip to the so-called landfill, i.e. the dump. But it was not a, quote, landfill. It was a mountain, a rapidly rising mountain, society's waste, a mountain of filth. Huge bulldozers were pushing it around, attempting to cover it up. Again, how, I wondered, could such a scenario be maintained? And society's treatment of its most innocent and helpless members. One of my first and earliest memories was in a restaurant with my parents. A mentally damaged restaurant worker dropped a plate of dishes. The adults in the room laughed in ridicule. I remember that moment with crystal clarity. I felt a profound sense of cruelty. I felt a profound sense of alarm at the behavior of those that I was led to believe were protectors of the weak and innocent, the so-called adults. These events and many more like them compelled me toward an ever deeper connection with nature, with the natural world. I wanted to see and to commune with the web of life. So many moments in complete isolation, detached from so-called civilization, staring at the starlit skies in the middle of the night, alone on isolated mountaintops which I had trekked to through magnificent ancient forests, encountering bears, deer, and other forms of wildlife all along the way. I have gazed at the same wondrous and seemingly infinite universe while floating on my back in the middle of the night, isolated and alone in formerly vast kelp beds at the Channel Islands off the coast of California. Sometimes I would turn over to see what looked like streaking meteors in the depths below me, the passing of a seal or larger fish that disturbed the bioluminescent plankton. It was far beyond magical and miraculous to me. Once, while freediving alone near the very isolated Tortuga Island in the Sea of Cortez, I suddenly found myself surrounded by massive, schooling mahi-mahi, the rainbow fish. They were circling me, so many of them, around and around. Beams of sunlight glistened down through the clear Gulf waters and reflected off the circling mass of life. A living carousel of astonishing beauty and color. I was mesmerized. I was frozen. I'd never heard of this species behaving in this way. I didn't want this moment to end, but I couldn't capture it or share it except by memory. And I believed correctly that such a moment would never come again. When I ponder all that I've been allowed to experience of the natural world, I know I can never repay the debt I owe to the whole, to the source, to the creator. But knowing I can never repay the debt will not prevent me from trying with every fiber of my being until my last breath. 100 times a day I ponder all that I've learned from 20 years of turning over every stone I could in regard to investigating the primary factors that present the most dire and immediate threats we collectively face. Threats that are easily verified for any that summon the courage to completely clear the lens through which they view the world. But even now, how many are willing to do so? How many still find themselves bound to beliefs and biases that have no basis in reality? How many still cling to the false belief, to the false hope that those in power would not, quote, do this to themselves? Is our horizon hopeless? Mathematically and statistically speaking, the answer would appear to be yes, but is there more to the equation? Are there factors that we cannot yet fully know or even comprehend? Are there elements to the equation that may yet defy the odds, that may even defy reason and logic itself? How can we know? We can't. Whatever comes, I will continue to hold to this principle, which is shared and revealed with the teachings of so many traditions, that it would be better to die 1,000 deaths than to desert the post at which the Creator has placed you. I first came across and considered this message at age 14, a message, in my case, delivered from the Stoics. However dark the horizon, however immense the challenges, we, each of us, is the sole guardian of our will. This, the Creator has entrusted to us. No one can ever take our will from us, ever. Can a critical mass of awakening actually be achieved? Is there still time? Can we yet make a difference? There's only one way to know. We must try. Check the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for the activist suggestions link to find out how you can help to turn the tide. Make your voice heard in this most critical battle to sound the alarm. Make every day count. Time is not on our side. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington from geoengineeringwatch.org.